It's been described as one of the most volatile moments in Indonesia in more than 20 years. Protests, furious clashes, alleged police brutality, riots, firebombing and looting.
Indonesia is burning. Parliament buildings have been set on fire. The streets roar with voices of defiance. Water cannons clash with fire. Stones rain down on riot shields. Jakarta trembles. Lives have been lost, homes destroyed, and politicians' mansions ransacked. At first, everything seemed to happen too quickly. But beneath the surface, anger had been piling up until it finally erupted like lava. And guess what? An anime cartoon skull became the symbol of defiance in Indonesia. The flag waves on every corner, no longer just a symbol of anime fantasy, but a pirate cry for freedom. Freedom from the worst that was packaged as the best. But why did Indonesians suddenly erupt like wildfire? And what are they demanding? Now, topics like protests and violence often get suppressed by the YouTube algorithm, but you can help us fight that by simply hitting the like button. Thank you. In 1976, a 26-year-old lieutenant was sent to Timor to track down the leader of Timor's independence movement, Lobato. 2 years later, the lieutenant's unit found and killed Lobato, and his severed head was mailed to the then Indonesian president as proof of death. The lieutenant's name was Prabowo Subianto, and he is the current president of Indonesia. Years later, in 1998, during mass student-led protests against the repressive regime in Indonesia, Prabowo led operations to kidnap, arrest, and torture activists, 22 of whom were disappeared by state authorities. But this did not stop him from becoming the president of Indonesia. In 2024, Prabowo Subianto rose to power as the 8th president of Indonesia. Before Prabowo came to power, his party made 5 powerful promises that won the hearts of millions of Indonesians. For some, he was a strong man, promising stability. For others, a controversial figure with a shadowed past. Yet, it wasn't the man alone. It was the spark that ignited the fire. He first vowed to supercharge economic growth, pushing it from 5% to 8% by harnessing Indonesia's vast natural resources and driving new industries. Second, he pledged to make Indonesia self-sufficient in food, ending dependency on costly imports. As defense minister, Prabowo had already launched the controversial food estate project, clearing swamps for cassava plantations. Now, he promised to expand 3 million hectares dedicated to rice, corn, and soybeans. To put that into perspective, that's the size of Belgium. Third, he promised to reduce Indonesia's dependence on imported fuel by blending more palm oil into biodiesel. Indonesia, after all, is the world's largest palm oil producer. His target? A 50% blend by the end of 2025, from 35%. Fourth, he pledged to nearly double government revenue as a share of GDP, from 12% to 23%, using new technologies but without raising taxes. And finally, the biggest and most emotional promise, the $28 billion free nutritious meals program, meant to provide food to 83 million children and pregnant women, a bold plan to fight one of Indonesia's most painful struggles, malnutrition. It's hard to believe that a plan that sounded so noble ended up sparking anger among millions of Indonesians, and for the right reason. You see, initially the free meals program sounded very powerful, because the reality on the ground is heartbreaking. Until March of 2025, 23.8 million Indonesians were officially living in poverty. But if you measure poverty by World Bank standards, those living on less than $6.85 a day, then the true number is staggering. 171.9 million people, or more than 60% of the population. This poverty fuels a silent epidemic. Nearly 1/3 of Indonesian children under 5 are stunted due to malnutrition. 1 in 4 people are anemic, and children and maternal malnutrition account for almost half of all child deaths in the country. To put it simply, malnutrition is killing children at a scale Indonesia can no longer ignore. So when Prabowo promised free nutritious meals, it wasn't just a campaign slogan. It was a lifeline. Parents, teachers, farmers, and the whole nation believed in this powerful plan. But then came the harsh reality of governance, because everything needed money. To fund the flagship Free Nutritious Meals program, the government announced massive spending cuts across vital sectors. Instead of prosperity, these cuts deepened an already growing cost of living crisis. And with youth unemployment climbing to 16%, the highest in 3 years, the anger of the young boiled over. The numbers were shocking. The Ministry of Public Works was forced to slash its budget by 80%, crippling basic infrastructure maintenance. The health ministry lost nearly 20 trillion rupiah, one of the biggest absolute cuts in Indonesia's history. To make matters worse, around 400 Indonesian schoolchildren fell ill after eating free school meals. This angered the citizens even more. The ripple effects spread everywhere. At the Ministry of Economic Affairs, lights were literally shut off during office hours to save electricity. The National Library cut its opening hours. The Finance Ministry canceled the prestigious 2025 ministerial scholarship. Even the Ministry of Higher Education redirected research funds away from innovation towards only one goal: propping up the school meals program. These cuts caused massive outrage among college students, who argued that the reductions would make education more expensive while gutting scholarships. On February 17th, thousands of students poured into the streets to protest against these budget cuts. The movement was dubbed Dark Indonesia, a clear rejection of the president's promise of a so-called Golden Indonesia. By February 20th, it had reached its peak. Hundreds of thousands of students marching in Jakarta and in other cities. This was the first wave of protests in Indonesia, but President Prabowo dismissed their anger, declaring that the cuts were necessary to fuel the country's economic future. As if one blunder wasn't enough, they did another one. In March of 2025, Indonesia's parliament passed a law that sent shockwaves through the nation. It gave the military a larger role in government, undoing decades of reforms meant to keep soldiers out of politics. Active duty officers could now serve in 14 civilian institutions instead of 10. Retirement ages were raised, allowing generals to cling to power even longer. And for many Indonesians, this was déjà vu. The military's dual function, controlling both security and civilian life, had been the backbone of former President Suharto's authoritarian rule, and often called a repressive regime. And here's the twist. Suharto's former son-in-law, Prabowo, once accused of abducting activists in the regime's final days, is today Indonesia's president. During his early military service, Prabowo's unit arrested and killed Nicolau Loboto, the leader of East Timor's independence movement. His severed head was delivered to then-President Suharto. With that mission, Prabowo began his long career, one marked by power, ambition, and allegations of brutality. As a general during Indonesia's occupation of East Timor in the 1980s and the 1990s, he organized gangs of hooded killers to terrorize civilians tied to the independence struggle. He was also allegedly involved in one of the bloodiest events of that war, the Caradas Massacre, in which 300 Timorese, mostly civilians, were hunted down and killed by Kopassus Special Forces. In 1986, he was dispatched to West Papua, where the Free Papua movement clashed with the Indonesian army. Prabowo's units carried out reprisal attacks, burning villages accused of aiding separatists. 2 years later, during the Asian financial crisis, student-led protests against Suharto shook Jakarta. Prabowo carried out a campaign to kidnap, arrest, and torture activists. 22 disappeared. 13 still remain missing to this day. After Suharto fell from power, Prabowo was kicked out of the military because of his involvement in these abductions. For years, even the United States, which had previously trained him, wouldn't allow him to enter the country. And yet, decades later, he now rules from the same presidential palace where, every Thursday, families still gather for a candlelight vigil. They wait for justice. They wait for the return of the disappeared. And because of Prabowo's own dark and controversial history, so deeply tied to Indonesia's authoritarian past, many saw his rise not as reform but as regression. For the veterans of Suharto-era democracy movements, this was not a new beginning, but the return of old ghosts. Hundreds of activists camped outside of parliament in defiance, warning that Indonesia was being pulled back into the shadows of dictatorship. The signs of rage were clearly visible. Millions of Indonesians were already angry. Any sane government would have taken steps to calm them down, but Indonesia did the exact opposite. In August of 2025, local government increased taxes on property and land, which fueled people's anger. Across Indonesia, a wave of protests erupted, one of the most visible and dangerous tests of President Prabowo Subianto's young administration. In Pati, central Java, the fury boiled over. On August 13th, thousands of residents, mostly farmers, marched against a shocking policy. Their land and building tax, known as PBB-P2, had suddenly jumped by more than 250%. In 2024, they paid just 179,000 rupiah. In 2025, the tax bill arrived at 1.3 million rupiah. Even after being revised down, families were still paying 3 to 4 times more than before. For farmers already crushed by rising fuel and food prices, this was the breaking point. But what enraged people the most wasn't just the taxes. It was the arrogance of their leaders. Regent Sutowo, a proud member of Prabowo's Gerindra party, dismissed the protests with a taunt. "Don't just bring 5,000 people, bring 50,000. I will not be afraid. I will not change my decision." That defiance lit a fuse. On October 13th, thousands demanded Sudewo's resignation. Police clashed with the crowd. Tear gas filled the air. 64 people were injured. Sudewo eventually backtracked, announcing the tax would return to 2024 levels and promising reimbursements. But it was too late. For the people of Pati, the trust was gone. They wanted him out. And it wasn't just Pati. In South Sulawesi's Bone Regency, property taxes skyrocketed by 300%, sparking student uprisings. In Cirebon, West Java, hikes ranged from 150 to 1,000%, driving thousands into the streets. In Jombang and Semarang, anger spread until the Interior Ministry was forced to step in and tell local governments to stop squeezing their people dry. Analysts pointed out the obvious. This wasn't just local greed. With Jakarta cutting transfers to regional governments, regents and mayors had little choice but to hike taxes to survive. The collapse of central funding had pushed the burden directly onto ordinary citizens. Just a few days later, on the 17th of August, 2025, Indonesia marked 80 years of independence from Dutch colonial rule. Every Independence Day, people proudly celebrate by waving the national flag. Even this year, flags were seen, but just not Indonesian ones. Instead of parades of unity, a strange and unexpected flag began flying across the nation, a pirate flag. And not just any pirate flag, the skull and crossbones wearing a straw hat, made famous by the Japanese anime One Piece. In the series, the flag belongs to Monkey D. Luffy, the dreamer who vows to become the Pirate King, a symbol of hope, of freedom, of rebellion against tyranny. In Indonesia, the flag had taken a whole new meaning. Raised beneath the Merah Putih, Indonesia's proud red and white national flag, the straw hat skull became the banner of protest. A sarcastic cry of defiance against rising prices, crushing unemployment, and a government increasingly seen as authoritarian and incompetent. It started small. Truckers first flew the flag in protest of new regulations banning overweight vehicles. Had it ended there, it might have been forgotten. But then came the budget cuts. Then came the mass layoffs, and then came the legislation expanding military power. And suddenly the flag spread like wildfire. It is everywhere, painted on houses, taped to motorcycles, draped from fishing boats, flying from cars, even waved in rallies right beside the national flag. For the young, it is satire. For the poor, it's rebellion. For everyone else, it's become a simple message. Indonesia has had enough, and the numbers back it up. Youth unemployment now stands at 16%, one of the highest in South Asia. A survey found that only 58% of young Indonesians were optimistic about the government's economic future, compared to 75% in neighboring countries. Foreign investors are fleeing, families are struggling, and hope itself is vanishing. But until mid-August, the anger mostly lived online. Hashtags trended, videos went viral, and frustrations echoed across digital walls. But on the streets, there were scattered student groups here, workers' unions there, while most ordinary people kept their distance. And then came the insult that turned outrage into fury. Even as the poor lined up for scraps of food from the government's faltering free meals program, even as families buried their children, like little Raya, parliamentarians quietly awarded themselves 50 million rupiah monthly housing allowances, about an extra $3,000 each month. To put that into perspective, Indonesia's GDP per capita hovers around $4,900 a year. That single allowance equals nearly 10 times Jakarta's minimum monthly wage. In poorer provinces, it is 20 times the average worker's salary. According to watchdog groups, when all perks are counted, some MPs now take home nearly 230 million rupiah a month, close to $14,000. For most Indonesians, it wasn't the exact number that cut so deep, it was the contrast. On August 26, 2025, a name shook Indonesia: Raya. A 4-year-old girl from Sukabumi, West Java, whose face would soon flood every phone screen in the country. Raya died of sepsis, worsened by malnutrition, stunting, and tuberculosis meningitis, conditions made harsher by the government's faltering free meals program. Her story went viral. Her death became a symbol of a nation's broken promises. And she was not alone. In Central Java that same month, at least 365 children suffered similar fates. Lab tests revealed spoiled ingredients, poor sanitation, and a system stretched beyond its limits. As parliamentarians padded their salaries with allowances worth more than most Indonesians earn in years, children were dying from contaminated food meant to save them. Raya's name turned quiet anger into full-blown outrage. This was not just disappointment. This was betrayal. Prabowo's government had promised the people that the program would be delivered without raising taxes, without cutting vital services. It was the audacity, the arrogance. While children were dying from tuberculosis, malnutrition, and roundworm infections, the so-called representatives of the people were fattening their pockets. And when confronted, some MPs didn't even bother to hide their contempt. The protest started in waves, deadly waves that might have been avoided if Indonesian politicians would have just kept quiet instead of making foolish statements. One was quoted as saying, "Do not compare us to the commoners." Another mocked those demanding accountability, calling them the dumbest people in the world. It was as if the ruling elite had declared openly what many Indonesians already feared, that democracy was no longer about the people. It was about the powerful. At its core, the uprising in Indonesia is not just about free school meals or rising property taxes, or even corrupt politicians. It's about something much deeper: inequality. For years, Indonesia's middle class has been shrinking, crushed between soaring costs and stagnant wages. While the government boasts that the nation's Gini coefficient, a measure of inequality, has improved, the reality is far harsher. Indonesia still suffers from some of the highest inequality levels in Southeast Asia. An Oxfam report laid it bare. Indonesia ranks 6th in the world for wealth inequality. Just 4 of the richest people control more wealth than the poorest 100 million Indonesians combined. For the poor, daily life is a cycle of survival. Low wages, job insecurity, families pushed further into poverty with ever-increasing prices. Education remains out of reach for many, trapped behind high fees and systemic barriers. But still, people were protesting peacefully, demanding to remove new ratification of Indonesia's National Armed Forces law, decrease property taxes, and remove new housing allowances. They marched, they rallied, anger was loud, but it was still contained. But then another sparking incident happened which converted this protest into a movement. You see, on August 27th, the protest reached the West Kalimantan province. Students from Tanjung University marched to the regional parliament, demanding an end to the housing allowance for lawmakers. At first, the demonstration was peaceful. But then police fired tear gas. Chaos followed. 15 protesters were arrested, though they were released 2 days later after signing pledges promising not to repeat their actions. At this point, the protests were still mostly about students and labor unions. The rest of Indonesia was angry at parliament, yes, but not ready to take to the streets. That changed on October 28th. In Jakarta, protesters marched to the national parliament. For a time, things were calm. But tensions rose when some students tried to breach the building and others hurled objects at police. The police responded the only way they knew how. Not with dialogue, but with tear gas, high-pressure water cannons, and rubber bullets. But instead of scattering, the crowd grew angrier. Clashes spilled out from the parliament complex into a nearby shopping district, and even onto a major expressway and railway line. Public transport collapsed. The Palmera and Tanah Abang train stations were shut down. Hundreds of students were arrested. Those who escaped sought refuge in the Angola Protestant Christian Church. And then came the moment that would change everything.
When a police vehicle ran over a ride-hailing service driver in Jakarta. Afan Kurniawan was just 21 years old when it was reported hours later that he had died. Protesters attacked the police station.
In the middle of the chaos was Afan Kurniawan, a 21-year-old ojol driver. He wasn't a protester, he was simply there to make a delivery. But by then, the police had already called the Mobile Brigade Corps, BRIMOB, the paramilitary tactical unit of the National Police. Afan was in the wrong place at the wrong time. As the protest raged on, a BRIMOB armored 4x4 accelerated through the crowd. It hit Afan head-on. The vehicle stopped briefly as the crowd gasped. Afan tried to stand up, but then as thousands of phones recorded him, the BRIMOB driver slammed on the accelerator. The armored vehicle ran over him a second time before speeding away. Afan never stood a chance. Within minutes, the video spread online. Within hours, it was spreading across the country. And by the next day, Indonesia would never be the same again. Afan's death ignited a nationwide wave of riots. In city after city, protests turned violent. At least 10 more people lost their lives in the days that followed. Police stations and regional parliament buildings were set ablaze. The homes of politicians, especially those who had mocked the people's suffering, were ransacked and looted. Indonesia was no longer just protesting, it was rebelling. On August 29th, Afan Kurniawan was laid to rest. His coffin was escorted through Sukabumi streets by hundreds of fellow ojol drivers, their green jackets forming a river of grief and fury. The government, realizing the funeral itself could become a flashpoint, dispatched the Jakarta police chief. But you don't need to be a genius to know how that would go. The sight of a representative from the same force that killed Afan nearly sparked a riot at the gravesite. What followed was damage control on steroids. President Prabowo appeared on television, expressing sorrow over Afan's death. The government even gifted Afan's family a house, but the narrative had already slipped out of their hands. By the next day, massive protests erupted nationwide, from the west to the east. Buildings burned. In one case, 3 people were trapped inside and killed by the flames. The backlash was immediate. University students stormed police headquarters in Jakarta, demanding the chief's resignation. On October 31st, the rage turned personal. Crowds stormed the home of the finance minister. Electronics, jewelry, even a basketball hoop were carried out by looters. That same day, they targeted the lawmaker who had mocked protesters as the dumbest people in the world. His house was ransacked, and his sports car was smashed to pieces, broadcast live on TikTok for millions to see. And it wasn't just the politicians. Even celebrities weren't spared. Actor Surya Atma and his mansion was raided. His prized possessions, gone. His 12 cats were stolen. The government's response, not reconciliation, repression. Faced with an escalating crisis, President Prabowo canceled a planned trip to China and returned to Jakarta. He announced that lawmakers would give up their controversial housing allowances and other perks, but his words offered little comfort. Prabowo ordered the military and police to take firm action. The police chief authorized rubber bullets and non-lethal weapons against so-called anarchists who dared to enter police bases and dormitories. By September 1st, at least 6 people were confirmed dead in the riots. Another 20 were missing. And then something shifted. Fearing a brutal police and military crackdown, the All-Indonesian Student Executive Board, BEMSI, withdrew plans for another mass demonstration. For the first time in weeks, the protests fell into uneasy silence. The government thought that the protests had stopped, and everything was fine. The Indonesian president, who was in a hurry to visit China, rescheduled his visit and traveled to China for their victory parade on the 3rd of September 2025. But silence on the roads was not the end of unrest or surrender. It was regrouping. On that same day, a coalition of students, labor unions, and digital activists published a document online, a manifesto, a rallying cry. They called it the 17+8 Demands, named in honor of August 17th, Independence Day. YouTube just dropped a mind-boggling announcement. It is paying creators $64 million per day. Why? Well, because YouTube doesn't have enough creators. That is why you see videos on your homepage that have less than 1,000 views, like this one. Now, of course, that doesn't mean everyone should start a channel, but if you have ever wondered about starting a YouTube channel, or a faceless YouTube channel like this one, well, now's the perfect time. YouTube is paying creators millions every day, and it's pushing newer, smaller channels now more than ever. But I'm sure many of you have questions on how to get started and how to grow a channel. We get questions in our email all the time from some of you guys. So that's why we've decided to put all of our YouTube advice into one training bootcamp for the low price of completely free. So, if you're someone interested in starting your own YouTube channel, you can sign up for this bootcamp by clicking on the link in the description or on the screen. Sign up now because, unfortunately, unlike YouTube videos, the bootcamp is like a Zoom call, so it's limited to just 100 people. Okay, let's get back to the video. What began as grief turned into fury, and fury turned into a list of 25 demands, a blueprint for change. The demands were clear. For the president, withdraw the military from civilian life, end the criminalization of demonstrators, launch an independent investigation into the deaths of Afan Kurniawan, Umar Amaruddin, and others killed during the crackdown. For the DPR, the House of Representatives, freeze their own salary and allowance increases, cancel new perks and pensions, open their budgets to the public, and let the Anti-Corruption Commission dig into lawmakers who had abused their office. For the political parties, discipline arrogant cadres, show real commitment to the people, open dialogue with students in civil society. For the police, release all detained protesters, stop the violence, prosecute the commanders who ordered it. For the military, return to the barracks, stop acting as police, commit to staying out of civilian life. For the economic ministries, guarantee decent wages for teachers, health workers, drivers, and ordinary laborers, prevent mass layoffs, sit down with unions to fix outsourcing and wage systems. These were not whispers. These were the shouted demands from the streets of Jakarta, Surabaya, Makassar, Medan. The people want immediate action. But the 17+8 movement didn't stop there. Beyond the urgent demands, they issued 8 deeper reforms to be completed within a year. 1. Clean up parliament. 2. Reform political parties. 3. Draft a fairer tax system. 4. Pass a real anti-corruption law with asset seizures. 5. Transform the police into a humane, professional force. 6. Send the military back to the barracks once and for all. 7. Strengthen independent watchdogs and human rights bodies. And 8. fix economic and labor policies for good. By early September, the movement was no longer just about Afan, or even just about parliamentary greed. The streets of Jakarta now echoed with chants from students, activists, and the country's most powerful labor unions. Led by the Coalition of Labor Unions and the Labour Party, protesters gathered in the capital with a simple but explosive list of demands. And at the very top, an end to outsourcing. For years, millions of Indonesians have been trapped in a system where companies hired them through third-party agencies on short-term contracts, robbing them of basic protections, stability, and dignity. They demanded to stop this. They also called for a higher minimum wage, a freeze on mass layoffs, and reforms to labor taxes that weighed unfairly on workers already struggling to survive. And Jakarta was not alone. Similar protests erupted in other cities across the country, a wave that made it clear. This wasn't just a capital city movement. President Prabowo went on air with a carefully balanced message. On one hand, he announced that Parliament had agreed to reduce housing allowances and scale back costly foreign trips. But he was quiet about an Indonesian National Armed Forces law rectification. He even promised an investigation into the killing of Afan, vowing that those responsible would be brought to justice. But his warning was just as clear. While his government would respect peaceful assembly, he declared that looting and rioting were nothing less than terrorism and treason. His order to police and the military was uncompromising. Take the strongest possible action against the destruction of public facilities and the looting of homes and economic centers. And so they did. Across the country, more than 3,000 people have been arrested or detained, hundreds injured, at least 20 missing. Tear gas and rubber bullets have become the soundtrack of cities like Bandung, where protests near two universities descended into chaos. International alarm is growing. The United Nations called for an independent investigation into the alleged use of disproportionate force. Human Rights Watch accused Indonesian authorities of acting irresponsibly by branding protests as treason, reminding the world of Indonesia's long, bloodied history of excessive force against its own people. Foreign embassies from the US to Australia, from France to Canada, have issued travel warnings. Citizens have been told, stay away from the streets, stay away from the crowds. But Indonesian diasporas living in Australia, Japan, Germany, and other countries are openly protesting in these nations with 17+8 placards, supporting their own people. Indonesia's president has replaced 5 ministers in a lightning cabinet reshuffle after deadly protests. 5 ministers lost their jobs, including the finance minister, who previously served as the executive director of the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and managing director of the World Bank, and Budi Gunawan, the coordinating minister for politics and security. Prabowo chose the chairman of the Deposit Insurance Corporation to replace one of Indonesia's longest-serving finance ministers. Prabowo also removed ministers of cooperatives, youth and sport, and the Minister for Migrant Workers' Protection. However, the faith of the country is uncertain, because people are not ready to believe in the government or its promises about the future. The protests that once seemed crazy finally started cooling down. I said crazy because even foreign embassies, including the US, have issued warnings. TikTok, with its 100 million Indonesian users, suspended live streaming to keep the platform from becoming a spark in this digital wildfire. And this was the anger of a nation of 280 million people across 17,000 islands. In fact, not even Bali was spared. The island of tourists and temples became a battleground, where students and online motorcycle drivers stormed the police headquarters. Many now question whether outside forces fueled the protests, channeling public anger against the government. For the last few years, Indonesia has tried to hold both hands, the US and China. However, it's true that Indonesia's tilt towards Chinese investment and state visits shows that the current government is more pro-China, which is seen as a strategic drawback for America and other countries. President Prabowo made China his first overseas bilateral visit. It resulted in agreements between China and Indonesia worth up to $10 billion, primarily focused on green energy and technology. Until 2022, President Prabowo was banned from entering the US on account of allegations of human rights abuses, related to his time in Indonesia's Special Forces Unit, Kopassus, which led to him being forcibly discharged from the military in 1998. Yet the ban was removed after then-President Joko Widodo appointed Subianto as Indonesia's defense minister, and he was subsequently invited to Washington in 2020 during the first Trump administration. After China, Washington was Subianto's second official presidential visit destination in November of 2024, which shows, not only for Indonesia but for China and the US, Indonesia is a crucial player in this region. Indonesia lies between the Indo-Pacific Oceans, controlling the lifelines of global trade, the Strait of Malacca, the Sunda Strait, where most of East Asia's transport passes. To control the South China Sea, these passages are very important. Indonesia has good relations with almost every major power, so there are less chances of outside interference. And whatever is happening in Indonesia, it is somehow all the fault and failure of government policies. And as we saw, numbers clearly prove that. And what happens next? Will the president succeed in saving his regime, or will we see another coup like in Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh? Only time will tell.